Welcome back to Hadassah Jacksonville's Advocacy Primer, Jewish Women, Radicals, Rebels, and Reformers. If you were with us last time, we learned about 3 inspiring women of their time, Lillian Wald, and how she, because she was shocked with what she saw when she went to somebody's home, similar to what we were just talking about, she started a whole movement. And it became on Henry Street to help families. And it had to deal with medical things. Rose Schneiderman at 4'9", who began a trade union because she saw a need and she saw women who kind of needed bread and roses, which it took me a while to figure out what that was about, but I'm getting there. Okay, so you needed what you needed. You needed to be the woman part 2. Okay, and Emma Goldman, an anarchist. And what I did with her was I took a screenshot of what she had said, put it on my Facebook, and a lot of people really thought that was pretty cool for back then. Barbara Oberlander guided us through, and tonight we will learn more in hopes to find areas that are pivotal to us. You know, what are we looking for? What can we do to make it a better world? And I think what we just talked about right before, you know, how we've done this with mitzvah makers or with just, you know, and for sure with Hadassah, because I'm here with Hadassah, right? With my Hadassah hat tonight. So much is happening right now locally in the state of Florida and the United States. Hadassah, in its efforts to support women and families, reinforcing Jewish values and equity, we stand together to speak out for the legislation that we see going backwards. If the pendulum is swinging, it is not swinging forward right now, especially in Florida. Learning together throughout the year in our Rosh Chodesh monthly meetings, our book reviews coming up next month and tonight, and again in 2 weeks. Be inspired through Hadassah, advocacy and lifelong learning. And thank you to Goldie and Helen for setting this up, and everybody in the Rosh Chodesh group for helping to support it. We meet once a month, and we're studying about women on our, you know, doing our own research too. So now we're going to go. Thank you, Barbara.
Okay, thank you, Martha. And I'm going to now try to share my screen. Helen, yes?
Yes, you should be okay, Barbara.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you all can see this, I assume. And tonight, I'd like to talk about 3 fabulous, interesting, remarkable, powerful, influential women, all born within a decade of each other, political activists, reformers, people who made an incredible difference. And we're going to begin with Bella Abzug, who really was the first Jewish woman elected to Congress in her own right. She was a fighter for social justice all her life, a fierce believer in tikkun olam, in making the world a better place. Bella Savitsky was born in 1920 in the Bronx, just shortly before women got the right to vote. She was the second daughter of Russian Jewish immigrants. Her father owned a butcher shop, and he was somewhat of a political activist himself. And so the butcher shop was nicknamed the Live and Let Live Meat Market. Bella, even as a little girl, was competitive. She competed with boys in terms of marbles, checkers. She traded baseball cards. She climbed trees. She became a graffiti artist, among other things. And she also attended synagogue with the grandfather that she loved dearly, Wolf Tanklevsky. He was very, very proud of her because she had a beautiful, beautiful singing voice, and she impressed everyone. He would frequently call over his friends at the synagogue to hear her recite her prayers because she did it so brilliantly. But Bella remembered that after she recited the prayers, then she climbed the stairs to the balcony in this Orthodox synagogue and sat with the women, saying nothing else through the rest of the service. By 11 years old, she was going to a Zionist camp and she was part of a Zionist group. She planned to go to Israel, live on a kibbutz. In the meantime, she wanted to raise money for the fledgling Jewish state. She did this by speaking at subway stops and asking people to donate money. And really, very few people could refuse this impassioned girl. When her father died in 1933, she was prohibited, of course, from saying Kaddish in the Orthodox synagogue, but she stopped by on her way to school and did it anyway. She never doubted that the father would have approved of this, and her mother supported her also, saying, quote, Batlin Bella was born bellowing, unquote. And that's a tongue twister for sure. She continued her Jewish education while she was in high school. She went to the Florence Marshall Hebrew High after regular classes. Then she went to Hunter College. And while she was at Hunter College, she also took classes at the Jewish Theological Seminary Teachers Institute. At Hunter College, she was student government president, no surprise there, a political science major, also no surprise, and an early champion of civil rights and an activist. From Hunter, she went to Columbia Law School. It probably would have been Harvard, but in those days, Harvard did not accept women. At Columbia Law School, she was editor of the Law Review, and she developed two new passions. One of them was poker, and the other one was Martin Abzug, who she married in 1944. When she passed the bar in 1947, she joined a labor law firm that represented local unions. But she found that she was frequently overlooked when she walked into meetings. People would look at her and ask if she could bring the coffee. And so she decided she had to do something to make herself look more professional. And that meant wearing a hat. And this is what she said about it. I began wearing hats as a young lawyer because it helped me establish my professional identity. Before that, whenever I was at a meeting, somebody would ask me to get coffee. So hats became Bella's trademark, and she had quite a collection. In the 1950s, she opened her own law office. It was the time of McCarthy. And this young woman lawyer defended teachers. She defended radio, TV, Hollywood personalities who were accused of communist sympathizers during the McCarthy era. And she also defended a young Black man in Mississippi named Willie McGee. Here is an incredible photograph of her in Mississippi, sitting for the defense. You can see she's the only woman in the courtroom. Willie McGee was accused of raping a white woman with whom he had had a long consensual relationship. It was a very famous case. And an organization, a civil rights organization, hired Bella Abzug to go to Mississippi to defend him. She was pregnant, despite the fact that she had threats from white supremacist groups. She went. She reserved a hotel room, but when she got to Laurel, Mississippi, somehow the hotel room was already taken. And she ended up having to sleep in the bus station overnight. This woman had guts, that's for sure. She defended Willie McGee in the local trial and the appeals case all the way to the highest court of the land. The appeals did not succeed, and Willie McGee was one of the first people in Mississippi to be executed in an electric chair. Her activism continued, and in 1961, she and a group of friends created Women's Strike for Peace. This was a group to lobby for a nuclear test ban treaty and to stop our growing involvement in what would become the Vietnam War. When she turned 50, she decided to run for Congress, and it was quite a campaign. New York had never seen anything like Bella Abzug. As one New York newspaper said, quote, "This woman's place is in the House of Representatives." It was called a campaign of hats and homilies. And her daughter, Eve, said, "Please, please, we want her out of the House and into your house." And she did win. Bella Abzug won by about 10,000 votes, and she would serve in Congress for the next several years. She became involved with a government subcommittee on government information and individual rights. And she authored several very important pieces of legislation, including the Freedom of Information Act, which allows us to request secret government documents from the CIA, the FBI, etc. She was one of the first members of Congress to call for Nixon's impeachment and to introduce a bill protecting gay rights. She caused a lot of attention. Here she is on the cover of Life magazine. And in 1971, she helped to form an organization still going today. This is part of her legacy, the National Women's Political Caucus. Now, if you look at this photograph, you can't miss Bella standing in the back with her hat. That's Gloria Steinem, who will be talked about next week. Shirley Chisholm, one of my favorites, and Betty Friedan, who's also a subject for today. The purpose of the National Women's Political Caucus was to get women elected. This is their current slogan: recruit, train, and elect. And they were very, very important. They wrote one of the first laws prohibiting discrimination against women in terms of obtaining credit cards. Bella Abzug was interested in introducing Social Security for homemakers, and she worked very hard on the right of Soviet Jews to leave. In fact, there's something called the Abzug Resolution, which called on the Soviet Union to permit free immigration out of the country. She, as I said, served in Congress for 3 terms, and a Gallup poll in 1977 named her one of the most influential women in the United States. She was very recognizable everywhere she went. And this is a wonderful photo of her in action. You see the hat, you see the mouth, you see the fist. That was Bella Abzug. Norman Mailer said, and you know Norman Mailer was a master of sarcasm. He said that Bella Abzug's voice could boil fat off a taxi cab driver's neck. That's what her voice was like. There's no doubt that she yelled a lot. And this is what she said about it. "I've been described as a tough and noisy woman, a prize fighter, a man-hater, you name it. They call me Battling Bella, Mother Courage, and a Jewish mother with more complaints than Portnoy. There are those who say I'm impatient, impetuous. uppity, rude, profane, brash, and overbearing. Whether I'm any of those things or all of them, you can decide for yourself. But whatever I am, and this ought to be very clear, I am a very serious woman. And she was very serious about the causes that she was interested in. After her time in Congress, essentially, she worked for women's rights for the next several decades. President Jimmy Carter appointed her chair for the National Commission on the Observance of International Women's Year, and there was a National Women's Conference that she chaired in Houston in 1977. You can see her leading the parade. By the way, if you go to the left of Bella Abzug, you will see Billie Jean King. And all the way to the right, and there's Betty Friedan. She attended United Nations conferences on the status of women all over the world. And then in the 1990s, she was instrumental in helping to found this organization. It's called We Do, Women's Environmental and Development Organization. It is an advocacy group for women all over the world that combines concerns with environmental issues and gender equality. Bella Abzug is one of those people in history that's absolutely wonderful to quote. One of my favorites is, "We are coming down from our pedestal and up from the laundry room." I love that one. Here's another. "Maybe we weren't at the Last Supper, but we're certainly going to be at the next one." She identified as being Jewish and committed to Jewish ideals throughout her life. She arranged for Sally Priesand, one of the first women rabbis, to deliver the opening prayer at Congress's House of Representatives. Although she rejected some traditional aspects of Judaism, her connection to the religion was really positive. She said injustice had always bothered her. She learned that from the prophets. And as far as she was concerned, the lesson that she had absorbed was, quote, "To be a Jew is to care not only about ourselves, but about others." In other words, tikkun olam. And this is a wonderful picture of her at a women's seder, which, as you know, became quite common in the 1990s and even a little bit before. A final quote: "Women will not simply be mainstreamed into the polluted stream. Women are changing the stream, making it clean and green and safe for all. Every gender, race, creed, sexual orientation, age, and ability." Here's to you, Bella Abzug, a woman activist, a radical, a rebel, a reformer, all three in one. In 1963, about the same time that Bella Abzug was establishing the group Women Strike for Peace, Norton Publishing Company gave the okay to print, 3,000 copies of a new book that they didn't really think would sell very much. It was a book by a woman journalist. The book was called Feminine Mystique. The woman journalist was Betty Friedan, who was not really known very much at that time. This book was not typically journalistic in style. There was little personal or autobiographical information, and it had a lot of scholarly quotes and references. It depended on psychology and sociology. There was an analysis of advertising, of colleges, all kinds of things. It wasn't easy reading. 3,000 copies. Within a few months, they had to publish another run, 60,000 copies. In 10 years, the sale of this book was over 3 million. And today, the book has sold, been translated into several languages, and has sold many, many millions. Clearly, the book and its author generated a huge interest. And in the views of many historians and authorities, this book played a major role, unexpectedly, in the resurgence of the women's movement in the 1960s. And the woman who wrote it, Betty Friedan, found herself not just a writer, but a leader of the women's movement. Betty Naomi Goldstein was born in 1921 in Peoria, Illinois. She came from a middle-class family, and her father was a jeweler. There were maids in her household. She didn't want for anything, but she witnessed tension between her parents, which she later said was the result of her mother giving up a potential career in journalism for her husband and family. She said, quote, "My own feminism began in my mother's discontent," unquote. She also, as the only Jewish girl in her high school, and therefore denied admission to various clubs that were called sororities, she experienced anti-Semitism. And she said later that this experience created in her a passion against injustice of various kinds. She went to Smith College, where she majored in psychology, graduated summa cum laude, and she went to California to work with a very famous psychologist, Erik Erikson. She obtained grants for graduate work, and she was on her way perhaps to getting a PhD in psychology, but she suddenly decided to leave and go to New York and pursue a career in journalism. She had started a literary magazine in high school, and she had edited the Smith College newspaper, and she really had liked it. She also remembered that her mother had a journalism career that had been stopped. So in New York, she worked on various newspapers. She got married in 1947 to Carl Friedan. Here she is pictured with him and her first son, Daniel. She would eventually have 3 children. And they ended up living in the suburbs of Rockland County, New York, during the 1950s. Now, when you say the word suburbs and put it together with the 1950s, I hope you can conjure up an image, because what happened in the post-World War II era was that there was a huge demand for housing, and there was also a baby boom. So developers came into areas outside of cities and put up these enormous suburban developments with houses that tended to look alike, that were very affordable. It was kind of an artificial existence, because the women who lived in those houses, for the most part, were full-time housewives, and the men left the houses and went off to the city to work. Some of you may know the song "Little Houses on the Hillside," "Little Houses Made of Ticky-Tack." I mean, that's one of the songs about the 1950s. And that's where Betty Friedan, in a sense, found herself, although she did keep up her writing. And interestingly enough, she wrote for labor publications and newspapers, particularly the United Electrical Radio and Machine Workers of America, partially because they were one union with a strong commitment to equality for women and African Americans. She wrote about the problems of working women, became interested in that, and she also freelanced for women's magazines. Then in 1957, something that would change her life forever. She decided to compose a questionnaire to her Smith College class of 1942 and ask about their lives 15 years after graduation. What she got back surprised her. Many of them were not happy. They were certainly living comfortable lives, but there was a sense of dissatisfaction, of non-fulfillment, of boredom, of problems. And she sensed that something was not right. So she began to do systematic research into popular women's magazines, into the field of psychiatry, into sociology and education, all kinds of things. And she interviewed other women. The timing was right, because even in 1956, Life magazine had published a special issue called The American Woman. And I know it's hard to read, but under the title, it says her accomplishments and troubles. There were some issues that had come up when they looked at American women in the 1950s. And Esquire got into it in 1962. They had had some critical articles on the effect of suburban life. And they talked about this malaise that seemed to be affecting suburban women. And so Betty Friedan put this all together. And here we have what became this bestseller. These are different editions of The Feminine Mystique. Now, what she said in this book was that essentially there was a mystique that women achieved real fulfillment only through domestic roles, being housewives, being mothers. And this idea was being perpetuated in every sphere of American life. But there was a discrepancy between what this mystique said and the reality that she called, quote, the problem that has no name, unquote, this sense of dissatisfaction. And she began to dissect what it was about. Now, from the very beginning, you need to know that the book was about and really addressed to middle-class white women. But it took on psychology. It took on Freudian theories that women were neurotic if they wanted careers. It took on pop culture and TV ads that tried to convince women that they were part of the new science if they just tried a different kind of detergent or a special kind of window cleaner. And it's an incredible dissection of all of this. I'm sure that many of you remember the ads from the 1950s, and they were very typical. A lot of the ads showed gifts to women of household products. There's a woman on the left, and of course, she's getting a new vacuum cleaner. And then there were the disparaging ads. You can see this one on the right for a new bottle of ketchup with an easy open top. You mean a woman can open this? I mean, those were what the ads were like in the 1950s. And it was all about this. She even quoted Adlai Stevenson, who was presidential candidate in the 1950s. And he went to Smith for their graduation class of 1955. And he told the Smith grads that their task, quote, in life was to influence men and boys through the humble role of housewife. That's what Adlai Stevenson said. But in general, the book was not about politics. It was not about religion or economy or law. The last chapter, A New Life Plan for Women, was not a call for a women's movement. It was a call for individual women to find their own answers. This is a quote. A woman has got to be able to say and not feel guilty, who am I and what do I want out of life? She mustn't feel selfish and neurotic if she wants goals of her own outside of husband and children. I have to tell you that when I was in graduate school, one of the women who was a friend of mine who wanted to get a PhD was sent to a psychologist because her husband's family felt that something must be wrong with her, that she wanted to go on to graduate school. I'm happy to say that this woman went on. She won various fellowships and she became one of the first professors of women's studies at my alma mater, Wellesley College. But I remember very clearly having those conversations with Fran and her being pushed to get psychological help because she wanted to go to graduate school. This was not that uncommon. The book, as I said, was narrow and had obvious failings. It didn't address issues for Black women who always had to work. It didn't address the problems of blue-collar working women. It didn't talk about the fact that in many states, women couldn't get their own credit cards or sign a mortgage. The omissions are startling if you read the book today. But it was directed at this very specific group. And as Gail Collins has suggested, the omissions were its strength because it was a very specific cry of rage about the way intelligent, well-educated women were treated. It was very personal. It had gut-wrenching power and it packed a wallop. It really did. It made a major influence. And Friedan suddenly found herself being asked to talk at prestigious places like Harvard University at the Schlesinger Library. And here she is. And she was the center of a lot of publicity. And in a sense, this changed her life. In 1966, she was in the District of Columbia in Washington researching another book. And there was a conference being held in 1966 of state commissions on the status of women. John F. Kennedy, as president, had appointed a national commission on the status of women. Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair of that commission. It was one of her last acts before her death. As a result, state commissions on the status of women were formed. And there was a conference of them in Washington, and they saw Betty Friedan, invited her to come over and join them. And they were complaining. They were all complaining because even though the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that important piece of legislation, had under Title VII prohibited discrimination in employment on the basis of race, religion, or sex, and thousands of cases had been filed, nothing had happened. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Economic Opportunity Commission, had no interest in enforcing the law. And so these thousands of cases had been filed by women and nothing had been happening. So they all sat around talking about this, and Betty Friedan said, we need an organization. And they scribbled some ideas on napkins in their hotel room. And the next day they passed around the notes at lunch. And on the spot, they created a new organization that was called now the National Organization of Women. And here are some of the founding members. 1966, Betty Friedan is sitting on the far right. She would be the first president, and she would serve in that capacity for about 4 years. The goal of NOW was to bring women into full participation in the mainstream of American society, exercising all the privileges and responsibilities in truly equal partnership with men. So initially, NOW's goals were to open up the world of work for women. And they began to put pressure on the EEOC. Now, I want to tell you that the first convention of NOW was reported in the New York Times on the women's page underneath all the recipes. That's what they thought. You were looking at the founding of one of the most powerful, important national women's organizations. And right away, they began to, as I said, pressure the EEOC. What about those newspaper ads? Remember the help wanted ads? Columns for men, columns for women. They began to file complaints, petitions for hearings to amend those regulations on the wanted ads. And by 1969, the courts had ruled in favor of stopping those ads. And then NOW began to hire lawyers and to have a legal division. And they began to take on a whole slew of cases. And this is one of my favorites. Some of you may remember this. Lorena Weeks worked for Southern Bell. She was a secretary. She applied for a job as a switchman because the pay was better and she needed it for her family. But Southern Bell had a policy that women could not work at a job that required them lifting over 30 pounds. Now, those of us who've been mothers and carried a bag of grocery and a toddler at the same time realize how ridiculous this is. But on the basis of that, they refused her the promotion. She's pictured on the left. Her typewriter, which she had to carry around as a secretary, weighed 34 pounds. It was over 30. The NOW lawyer took her case. It took several years, but they won. And Lorena Weeks got her promotion. So NOW was off and running, and they became noticeable. They had a huge demonstration in 1970 called the Women's Strike for Equality. It was the 50th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. And you had 50,000 women march in New York. Their slogan was, "Don't iron while the strike is hot." I like that a lot. I think it's a good one. They worked to establish women's studies classes. They fought for the Equal Rights Amendment, for all kinds of things. And of course, I had to show this. This is my hometown of Boston, and there are members of NOW marching in favor of abortion rights and against racism. I will tell you that today, NOW has 550 chapters in all 50 states, and it has over 500,000 members. There is a chapter here in Gainesville. I would say it's not all been smooth sailing. Betty Friedan was not happy with some of the issues that NOW took on, but NOW is out there fighting for women's issues. If you Google it, you can look at their website and see all the things that they're involved with. And Betty Friedan helped to found the National Women's Political Caucus in 1971. And here we go again with Gloria Steinem and Bella Abzug and Betty Friedan on the right. Their purpose was to elect women to political office They are still going strong today. Their slogan is "Make policy, not coffee." Betty Friedan and Bella and Gloria were all at the Democratic Convention in 1972, fighting for women's issues to be included in the Democratic platform. Here she is at the ERA March in Washington of 1978. And she wrote several more books. Her views changed and evolved. And in 1981, she wrote something called The Second Stage, where she admitted that perhaps she had been too harsh in her criticism of women who wanted to stay home and raise a family and found satisfaction in that role. She continued being active, meditating on what it was like for women to get older. This is a wonderful picture of her. And the last book she produced, The Fountain of Age and Life So Far. She served as visiting professor at various places, University of California, NYU, Cornell, Columbia, Temple, the New School for Social Research. She was busy. But it is the book, The Feminine Mystique, that many people feel was absolutely crucial in igniting the contemporary women's movement. And as a result, it permanently transformed the social fabric of the United States. Because the book transformed individual consciousness, it led many women to become activists. And Betty Friedan herself found herself at the head of that activism. She never denied her Jewishness. She spoke of her Jewish values as influencing her feminism, and said that, growing up and encountering anti-Semitism in Peoria, Illinois, had made her very conscious of what prejudice and discrimination can mean in different kinds of ways. So that's Betty Friedan. And I would suggest, if you haven't at least skimmed through The Feminine Mystique, you should, because it is quite amazing to look back at the kinds of things that she discovered. The last woman I want to talk about tonight is someone quite different. Her name is Ruth Gerber, and she is going to also repair the world. She is part of the Tikkun Olam tradition, but in a very different way, as a photojournalist who made a remarkable impression on people. Her parents were Russian Jewish immigrants, of course. She was born in 1911. She grew up in Brooklyn. Absolutely brilliant and unconventional student who graduated high school at 15, NYU at 18, went to the University of Wisconsin, got a master's in literature, and then won a fellowship to the University of Cologne, where she did PhD work. She wrote her PhD on Virginia Woolf. And at 20, according to the New York Times, she became the youngest PhD in the world. Now, she was in Germany in the 1930s, and she attended Nazi rallies, wondering what was going on. And she would write about this and say, she wasn't sure whether she should keep that little American flag pin hidden or not. But it made an impression on her. She came back to the United States, and of course it was the height of the Depression, and she had trouble finding jobs, but eventually she ended up working for the New York Herald Tribune for many years. And while she worked for the New York Herald Tribune, she won another fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, to study and to write about women's roles and status under communism, fascism, and democracy. So off she went to the Soviet Arctic in the 1930s. She traveled the length and breadth from Siberia to Yakutsk, as you can see on the map. She was the first foreign correspondent ever to be let into these parts of Siberia by Russian authorities. She produced a book called I Went to the Soviet Arctic, with the encouragement of her New York Herald Tribune editor, who said, quote, "You've scooped the world. You need to write about this." And she did. The New York Herald Tribune then sent her to Alaska, because Alaska was considered the next frontier, and people were talking about what Alaska's role would be in the war. There she met the Secretary of the Interior under Roosevelt, Harold Ickes, and he hired her to write a book on Alaska because he was hoping that Alaska would be open to GIs after the war. So for 18 months, this intrepid woman, by plane, train, truck, paddle wheel steamer, and dog sled, traipsed around Alaska, and eventually her photographs made their way into a book. In 1944, one of those events, that's a turning point. It was the issue of Jewish refugees being allowed to come to the United States. Now, as you know, we had a very anti-Semitic State Department, and it was very hard under the quota system for Jews to get out of Europe, and even Jewish refugees to come to the United States. Roosevelt had been given a report from the War Refugee Board that the United States was essentially acquiescing in the murder of Jews. And so he decided to open up the United States to 1,000 refugees who would be brought to this country under guest visas and housed at a former Army fort in upstate New York. Now, these were refugees that came from liberated parts of Italy.
This is how you see who's
Excuse
online.
me,
There's
Barbara, I'm
20
going to ask everyone to mute,
I
please.
don't care who's online.
Oh, wait, we need to
Here's
mute.
Helen.
We're going to ask everyone to mute, please. Thank you.
So there were 3,000 possible people, and 1,000 were chosen to come to the United States. Ruth Gerber heard about that, and she immediately went to Harold Ickes, Secretary of the Interior, since she knew him, and said, look, I can go on the ship with those people. They will be frightened. They will be terrified. Most of them don't speak English. I speak German. I speak other languages. I can act as an interpreter. I can help them. And so she was appointed as a special emissary to go to Italy and then get on the ship with the refugees. Now, I want you to know that Ruth Gerber's mother heard about this and was not happy. And she went to the Secretary of the Interior and said, you cannot send my daughter on this dangerous mission. I am very frightened. And he said to her, don't worry, we're going to put Ruth in a military uniform so that if she's captured, she will be treated as a military officer. And so the mother left and was satisfied with that. This is the ship, the Henry Gibbons. It was an Army transport ship. It set out from Naples, and there were 1,000 wounded soldiers in the rear and refugees in the front. It was surrounded by a convoy of warships because, of course, they were concerned about Nazi submarines. And Ruth Gerber was on board taking photographs. She took photographs of children playing chess next to a makeshift pharmacy. She took this incredible photograph. And you can see some of the refugees are still wearing their outfits from concentration camps. Here she is. If you look carefully, you'll see her in the third row, and she is indeed wearing a military uniform. She said that this was the moment for her. She listened to their stories, and she believed that every one of them who was alive as the result of a miracle. And that indeed every Jew who was alive in the world was alive through a miracle. This is how she wrote about it. Before the Holocaust, I was an innocent, convinced that someday there would be no more nationalism, no more racism, no more anti-Semitism. I have a theory. You can be born a Jew, but there is a moment in your life when you become a Jew. I became a Jew on that ship. From that moment on, I realized that my life would be bound up with rescue and survival. And indeed, it was. Here is a shot of the refugees. They arrived in New York, as they arrived in New York. This is how they were housed at Fort Ontario and Oswego. These are converted Army barracks. Another photo that she took of the children there. The boys actually, eventually, when they learned English, formed a Boy Scout troop. And she would write about this. Another book, one of many, called Haven, the dramatic story of 1,000 World War II refugees and how they came to America. I think for a long time, this story was not well known, but there was an article maybe about a year ago in the New York Times interviewing some of the people who were actually there, and they talked about their experiences. She stayed on at Oswego to help them settle in. She helped with labor conflicts, depression, health, and sadness. She persuaded the National Council of Jewish Women, yes, to underwrite English classes for the refugees. And the refugees referred to her as their guardian angel. She became this spokesperson documenting the stories, and she lobbied for a change in the policy. Because under Roosevelt's order, after the war was over, all the refugees were supposed to go back to the country from which they had originated. And of course, none of them wanted to go back. So she lobbied, and eventually President Harry Truman issued a directive allowing these people to enter as displaced persons. What that meant was that the refugees first had to cross the border into Canada, get visas to go to Canada, then cross back from Canada into the United States, and they were essentially admitted as displaced persons. After the war, with identification from the Adjutant General's Office of the War Department, Ruth Gerber, as a correspondent, visited Palestine. She visited the displaced persons camps in Europe. She wrote a profile of David Ben-Gurion, by the way, which made Americans more receptive to the idea of building a Jewish state. And when she visited the displaced persons camps, she bore personal witness to the conditions there. And she just happened to be in Haifa in 1947 when she heard about a ship. The ship, of course, was the Exodus, and it was coming to Palestine with 4,500 Holocaust survivors trying to enter that land against British regulations, against British mandates. The Exodus was a worn-out US coastal passenger ship. It was built for 450 and it had 4,500 people in it. According to the British, it was carrying illegal immigrants, and they attacked the ship when it was offshore and then boarded it. It was rammed by British ships and then dragged into Haifa with the 4,500 people aboard. The British plan was to take the passengers off and put them on hospital ships to go to Cyprus, where the British had detention camps. Then they changed their mind and they decided that they would, yes, put the people from the Exodus on ships, but they would be taken back to France, to a port near Marseille where they had started. The people, of course, refused to get off. The British had to use force to put them on the 3 ships that were going back to France. And Ruth Gerber was one of the only journalists who was allowed to see this happening. And she was allowed on one of the ships. It was called the Runnymede Park. And you can see the conditions. The ships actually went back to France where people refused to get off. They went on a hunger strike. And she described vividly the terrible conditions on this ship, the high temperature. She said, quote, people were in steel cages as if they had been thrown into a dog pound. The smell, the agony, the contempt for life made me want to shake the world. How can you let this happen? She asked in her articles. And this is a very famous picture that she took. There were 1,500 refugees on this British ship, the Runnymede Park, and protesting their imprisonment, the survivors painted, and you can see it, a Nazi swastika on top of the British flag, the Union Jack. Now, she took this photograph, and I've chosen to show you what's on the right-hand side because this photograph was sent to Life magazine. It was sent to the AP press around the world. It was sent everywhere by the Herald Tribune, and it helped to transform attitudes about British policy and the need for a Jewish state. After the birth of Israel, Ruth Gerber made it essentially her life's work to cover the plight of refugees. And by the way, she wrote a book, of course, about her experience. It was called Exodus 1947. And evidently this is the book that inspired Leon Uris to write a novel called Exodus, which then led to a film. So you start with her reporting her book, and it snowballs into a lot of publicity about this. Here's one of her incredible photographs about Yemenite refugees arriving in Israel. As each group of refugees would come to Israel after its founding, she would take these incredible photographs, which were published around the world. And she was the only journalist who was allowed to cover the secret operation called Operation Moses, getting Ethiopian Jews out of Ethiopia, where they were starving and being persecuted. And as you know, there was this famous secret night airlift, and Ruth Gruber was the only person who was allowed to be there and take a photograph. She followed up with actual travels to Ethiopia. This is one of her famous photographs of an Ethiopian mother who's holding a photo of children who had already emigrated to Israel. And of course, she wrote a book called Operation Moses. She continued to work and write. Ruth Gruber lived into her hundreds. She wrote 19 books in total. This is a picture of her in her New York apartment in 2010. I believe in this photo, she's 99. She's surrounded by Ethiopian artwork, which is one of the reasons I like this photo. And I think if you look at Ruth Gruber, you have to understand that she, after her experience on the Henry Gibbons, she devoted her life to making people aware of the plight of refugees. And she herself became involved in these issues of rescue, sanctuary, liberation. This is a wonderful quote from her, and it really sums it up. Look inside your soul and find your tools. We all have tools, and I have to live with the help of them. I have two tools, my words and my images. She was talking about tools to combat injustice. Quote, I thought that wherever there was injustice, we should fight it. And what better tool than journalism? My words and my images. And she indeed did turn those into powerful tools. So 3 women tonight, born within a decade of each other, women who had a powerful influence, not only on the United States, but on the world in many ways. Their accomplishments are, in a sense, mind-boggling and very impressive. Thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to entertain questions. Let me close this out.
I would just like to hold up a couple of pillows from Ethiopia that look pretty similar to the kind of work that she was
yes,
that she enjoyed. My niece Debbie was part of a group that went to Ethiopia to give a formal conversion process to the people who wanted to arrive in Israel with their status clear as Jews. And since then, this is what we've been collecting.
Ah, how wonderful. And there is, of course, an American group that's involved with Ethiopian Jewry.
Yes, yes.
That's very active. I think it's based in New York, actually. It is based in New York. Anything else?
A wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, it's Ruth Cohn. I just want to add a Hadassah note to this. Ruth Gruber was on the magazine, Hadassah magazine editorial board for many, many years. And I used to see her very often coming in for meetings because she always came up to the 7th floor, which was our executive floor. And
That's
it was always a
interesting.
delight. Yeah, it was a delight. She was a delight. And I also saw her speak in Jacksonville. Now, I don't know exactly when, but I moved to Jacksonville in 1998. So it had to be in the early 2000s. And she was just quite outstanding that evening as well.
Thank you for sharing that. I did not know about her being on the Hadassah
The
editorial. board.
magazine, yeah,
Yeah.
the magazine, many years.
Many. Yes. Sandra, I think it is.
Sandra, I was
Sandra,
curious.
yes.
I was curious as what happened to the people that were the three different ships. The people refused to get off,
Yeah.
you had said, but then what happened after that?
Well, actually, most of them were sent to detention camps. And actually, the British took them back to displaced persons camps in Germany. And most of them ended up, out of the 4,500, most of them ended up being smuggled in one way or another back into what would become Israel. The majority of them did make it, and it's amazing. Thanks to the Haganah and other groups, they went back, but they were taken from France. First, they thought they would go to Cyprus, and then the British, leave it to the British, said, no, we have these camps in Germany, displaced persons camps, and we'll take them there. And there was a rumor that the DP camps were former concentration camps, but that was not the case. But it was in Germany, and for many of these people, that was, you know, the worst possible thing, going back there. But they were eventually, most of them made it to Israel. I'm very happy to say that. Yes.
Did Ruth
Melissa.
Gruber's,
I'm sorry. Who is speaking? I missed.
so I have a question, Barbara, it's Goldie. Did Ruth Gruber's interest in refugees extend beyond Jewish refugees?
I think she mostly concentrated on Jewish refugees, but she was concerned about the problem of refugees in general. Yes. Yeah, because she was exposed to that when she, when she went to Europe after World War II, there were lots of refugees and they weren't all Jewish. I mean, there were many people in displaced camps. Yes. But she felt that that strong Jewish connection. That was a life-changing experience for her, being on the Henry Gibbons and hearing these people's stories. Yes, Georgia?
Yeah, I'm interested in Betty Friedan's relationship with most of the Jewish synagogues or Jewish community, because at that point, I don't know. It seemed like it would be very hard for more conservative synagogues, and I don't mean conservative,
Big C.
different C there, to want to support anything where women did not have traditional roles. But maybe I'm wrong.
Well, as you know, Betty Friedan's book, 1963, I mean, we're starting to see changes in Judaism come by the 70s, even before. I remember we moved to Gainesville in 71, and very soon afterward there was, in my synagogue, which is conservative, there was a whole issue of including women in the minyan. We had a vote on that. And so the changes were coming just as she became more active. But, as you touched on, many of those kinds of changes are difficult. They're slow moving. And she was not an easy person. I will say, everyone has commented on that personality-wise. She could be imperious, she could be domineering, she could be sarcastic. I mean, a lot of the people that she was associated with eventually kind of moved away. So I can't see her having an affiliation easily with a synagogue. Other questions or comments? I thought I saw some other hand. I do, Martha.
Barbara, okay, so I see a very interesting trend. I mean, I see very prestigious universities these women went to early in the years, and also these organizations, some of which I hadn't heard of, like We Do. I mean, now I heard of, but We Do I hadn't heard of. That's very interesting. And I just wanted to say that my mother, I guess, inspired me because of the frustration she had as she graduated in 1949 from college and moved into one of those little houses in West Miami, and all the women were home and she was selling Avon and just so frustrated. She just was, she's still frustrated now. I talked to her today. She's, you know, it just was the time and the times. And when I read The Feminine Mystique the first time, I was like, this is my, you know, this is the times.
Yeah.
And then when the Jacksonville Jewish Center didn't allow women, even after in the Million, even after my synagogues in Miami were doing it, I came up here and I saw they weren't. And so, you know, different wheels turn at different rates, Georgia, and everything. The thing that I'm impressed too, both last week and this week, NCJW was mentioned. Now, I love my NCJW, but both times they were doing something to assimilate the people into the community, which was partially because it was made up of, I think at the beginning, German Jews, and they didn't want the embarrassment in the 1905, the 19 early years, nor when people were coming in as refugees. They wanted to make sure everybody was like lifted up.
Yeah.
So,
well,
Gloria
I
and
think
are
their involvement with the people in Oswego was essential because these people didn't speak English.
Mhm.
And in order to function, and many of them wanted to have jobs and do things like that, they needed to have the language skills.
Correct.
So,
So when we saw a need, we made it happen. Okay,
Yeah.
that's my shtick for that for today.
yeah.
Barbara, I recently saw a documentary on this Oswego experience, which up until I saw the documentary, I must admit I had not heard of it. And it was either called Haven or Safe Haven. It might be very much like the name of her book. If I find the link to the documentary, I'll be glad to send it out for anyone to look at. It was absolutely fascinating, and I believe that ship was the only ship of Jewish refugees that came successfully to the
absolutely
United States.
And they did it almost secretly. I mean, when after they landed, they put them on a train at night and everything because there was so much opposition, even in 1944, to allowing Jewish refugees to come to the United States. It's almost incomprehensible to me, but it was there. Absolutely. And Roosevelt was trying to juggle so many different things. By the way, my heroine, Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, went to Oswego. You know, she had to visit them. Yes.
I have a question. So I'm Jody Seitlin, and I don't know if this is what Helen was just referring to, but I saw a film that was a documentary, but it was about the people who had come through at Oswego, and they had bought a camp that they had a reunion at every year, well into their 80s and 90s. And they had a community and a reunion. The Jewish couples who met during that time, and it was quite it was very special. I don't know if that's the same it didn't talk a whole lot about the back and forth with the ship. It was much more about these folks settling in and having this land. And it was like their own, not timeshare, but yes, it was a hotel that was just for them and that they enjoyed every year. And it was quite wonderful.
I think I saw that one too, Jody. I believe it's a different documentary, but they're both fabulous.
Mhm. And they are both about Oswego,
Mhm.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
I think there's a museum there now,
Mhm.
and you know that, but for a long time nobody knew about it. You know, it was almost hidden, except in the minds of the people who were there. And actually, there was supposed to be 1,000, and I think they ended up with 982. There were some people who never showed up and didn't get on the ship that came to the United States. But you know, it's so interesting that for such a long time, so little was written about this phenomenon. Okay, other comments?
So tell us who we're going to learn about in 2 weeks on the 30th.
Well, we're going to learn about one of the women that you kept seeing, Gloria Steinem, who also is quite an interesting figure. Judy Chicago, who is an artist who revolutionized the art world in many ways. And I am going to add a third one, although she wasn't on Helen's wonderful collage. I'm going to add Deborah Lipstadt, the historian. After all, I'm a historian. I should probably talk about at least one Jewish woman historian. So I will choose Deborah Lipstadt. So that'll be next week.
It's a great series, Barbara, and we are certainly indebted to you for how willingly you share your expertise. So we are all very grateful. We are also very grateful to our underwriters who have made this possible. Our own Rosh Chodesh group, Laura Miller, Kathy Winterfield, and Helen Hill. It can sometimes feel like all of this happens just for nothing, like out of nowhere. But in fact, there are resources behind it all to make it happen. So we are extremely grateful to our underwriters. And what that means is that the registration fee that each one of you have paid is entirely used to support Hadassah's advocacy work, both here and in Israel. So of you have helped to make this happen. We're very grateful. We look forward to seeing you on June 30th at 7 o'clock. And I imagine that our dear friend Helen will send out another reminder with the Zoom link before that. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't also remind everybody that July follows June. And if it's July, then that means Hadassah is doing its book reviews. So sure enough, every Tuesday morning in July is book reviews. You will soon be receiving the publicity that announces the name of each book, who will be reviewing it. And we hope to see you all at all Hadassah events. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Good night,
Stay well,
everyone.
and we'll see you soon.
Great.